We can all make beautiful gardens that make a big difference as climate challenges impact our resources and habitat. To learn more, today I'm joined by Ted Moss of Moss Verde Landscape Restoration to walk us through easy ways to get started. How's it going, Ted?
Good.
Thanks for being here. This is a big subject for a lot of people because we've had so many sort of curveballs thrown our way with the climate. If I'm a client and I've got a yard and it has just crashed, we've got brown stuff, we've got bare soil, how in the world would I fix that? How would I go about getting started?
I think getting started with defining your goals is really important and how you want to use the space. And then we can focus on site conditions and soil conditions and planting areas, and then how to kind of move forward from there as far as design goes.
Okay, so well, let's dive in a little bit to the plant part, because use, that'll be per the clients, and everybody's going to be a little bit different in that aspect. But what about plants? So should we just go with a really simple palette, or should we maybe look at a diverse plant community that consists of different species?
I think focusing on a diverse plant palette is a good way to go for our changing climate and changing conditions, the freezes, the droughts. It's good to have increased diversity for creating a resilient plant community. So if one species drops out, you've got another one that can fill in a niche, an ecological niche there.
So you're essentially suggesting that we're mimicking what happens out in nature, right? Because
Correct.
There aren't a lot of big single monoculture turfs out there. There's these diverse plant communities that are actually able to react to these challenges.
Correct. And in someone's landscape, I think it's the art that you're balancing aesthetic and functionality, and trying to make it a usable space for the person, for the community or the person.
Right. And so you mentioned the word function. So in case there are viewers that don't really understand, I mean, when we're talking about landscape function, there's certainly the use, but that's not necessarily what you're addressing there. You're talking about actually the landscape performing for us somehow. How would you elaborate on that?
Historically, we tend to want to move stormwater away from a landscape and into a storm drain and shoot it out.
Right.
From the landscape. So one function is to slow down that stormwater, use that stormwater as a resource on the property and not get rid of it. It's usable water. It can help with irrigation. So rain gardens are a popular concept for that. Nutrient cycling, trying to focus on when you create a plant community, you're really setting it up for moving it into a new direction, and kickstarting these ecological processes to help the soil start to restore itself through time and increase humus, organic material, and then therefore aiding in water retention and all that through time, so that you're not using as many inputs like water, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, that sort of thing.
I've heard the terminology for some of the older school of thought of design as landscapes on life support. So you're talking about a whole new way where the yard or the landscape is actually able to heal itself and to hold on to resources as opposed to requiring a lot of input.
Correct. For instance, leaf litter is a great, we want to take that off. Historically, we want to take that off the landscape.
Right.
We're kind of adding it back into the landscape. That's a really simple, no cost to the client way to increase organic material in the soil and therefore water retention.
And so when we talk about plant communities, you're talking about different types of maybe grasses, flowers, shrubs, trees. So how do you go about thinking about planting in layers? For someone who isn't familiar with this, what are plant layers?
Plant layers, I like to think of it as structure, ecological structure. So you can have your ground covers, your grasses, your shrubs, trees, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm. That plays a role in habitat as well, right? So if some people's goal would be, I want to attract more birds or a single species of bird or butterfly or something like that, that structural or that layering is important too, right? Because that essentially sets up habitat for those species.
Yep. Different resources for different wildlife that all interact with that space.
And so before we do all that, though, I think you've mentioned this a number of times, though, we've got to become familiar with the soil. How do we go about doing that?
I always like to suggest a soil test if that's in somebody's budget. It's always good to have a baseline of what you're working with as far as organic material and macro micronutrients, and then that way you can also use that as data to track over time. So as you plant the space, as you increase organic material, you can track that through time with soil testing over a couple of years.
And then soil tests, what are primary, I mean, there's a lot you can look at, but what are sort of the primary things you're looking at when you're doing a soil test?
Organic matter is a pretty big one. Acidity is also a pretty significant factor that influences cation exchange capacity and available nutrients for plants.
And then as far as the plants, I know they're native plants or adapted plants. Can you tell me a little bit more about why we might want to focus on native plants that could perhaps help certain other species, and then with the benefits of adapted plants as well?
Adapted plants versus native plants, it's kind of a pretty big debate, and I'm kind of more of the mindset is that as long as something isn't non-native invasive, that is going to move into our more natural areas and create a monoculture in our wild areas and be invasive, it's okay by me. It's part of that increasing diversity in a changing climate, really, and in the changing environmental conditions.
And when you say invasive, we're talking about a plant that essentially will just take over and push out
Correct.
all other species.
And then create a monoculture.
Timing is always key, right? You're not going to go in there and install a design in July, are you?
No. And that's a great point. That tree planting, the best time of year is in the fall.
Okay.
Fall through midwinter. So with these super hot summers that we've been having, it's kind of earlier and earlier. Any herbaceous species you could probably get away with later in the season, into the spring, especially if you have irrigation, supplemental water. But if you don't, just earlier is the better in fall, just to give them a head start.
When you're looking at establishment, that's something that takes some time, right? So that's where we're talking about that first year. It's not, it's sort of what I call that just, I'm going to install it in one weekend and then it's done. It's really about starting that process. And then with these communities, that should translate into, and native or adapted, that all should translate into less dependence on fungicides, right, and other things like that typically we see associated with non-native and invasive plant species, correct?
Correct. More diversity will bring in more insects and different organic structures in the soil that all just kind of help balance each other out, I feel like. So and especially with pests, wiping out, if you have just one row of trees and they all get decimated, you have nothing to replace it.
Right, and then with these native landscapes, so if they're getting munched on, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
No,
that's
it's not.
one reason why you don't need those pesticides. We want the critters in there enjoying that landscape.
Because that has a trickle effect through the whole food web.
Right.
Yep.
And then I know you're a big proponent of sourcing locally, correct?
Correct. Yep. So please do not buy plants from the big box stores. Most of the folks that work in our local nurseries, they are more aware of right plant, right place, what's working. They can give you really good insight into when to plant and that sort of thing.
Well, that's great. Well, Ted, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy, wonderful schedule to come and share with us some of these tips for how to approach, maybe redoing your yard after you've been hit by the drought or freeze. We certainly appreciate your insight and love having you here.